The summer of 1988 in Dorchester, Massachusetts, was the kind of summer that stuck to your skin. Humid, restless, and brimming with the kind of tension that made the nights louder than the days. Teenagers roamed the cracked sidewalks in packs. Music spilled out of parked cars, and the air pulsed with unspoken anger and misguided pride. Among them was a 16-year-old kid named Mark. He wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. Not yet. Back then, he was just another face in the crowd. White, restless, angry. A dropout with a short fuse, a mouth full of slurs, and fists that always seemed to find trouble before he could think. He and his crew were known in the neighborhood, not for kindness, not for charm, but for chaos. One afternoon, that chaos took a darker turn. A Vietnamese-American man named Johnny Trinh was walking along the street, minding his own business. A veteran, quiet and unassuming. He wasn't bothering anyone. But to Mark and his friends, he was a target, an outsider, something to mock, something to hurt. What happened next wasn't a scuffle. It wasn't a fight. It was an ambush. Mark approached Johnny, slinging racial slurs like poison-tipped darts. He hit him with a stick, knocked him to the ground, beat him until blood streaked the sidewalk. All while laughing, all while his friends egged him on. And when it was over, Johnny lay bruised, confused, and broken. Not just in body, but in spirit. Not understanding why. Why a boy he didn't know hated him enough to cause this much pain. The police report was clear. The motive was hate. And the attacker, Mark, was charged, convicted, and sentenced. 45 days in jail. Not nearly enough, but it was something. Then time moved on. Mark did too. He changed his name, got into music, built a body, became a Calvin Klein icon. And then, movies. Big ones. Blockbusters. He became a millionaire, a household name, a Hollywood darling with charm, muscles, and an ever-expanding resume, from Boston streets to Beverly Hills. But underneath the fame, something festered. A memory, a face, a punch, and the sound of someone he didn't know screaming in pain. That scream never left him. And while the world clapped for Mark's success, the boy inside, the one who once chose violence over decency, never stopped whispering. Guilt had a voice. It just took decades for him to listen. This isn't a story about a celebrity scandal. It's not even about crime and punishment. It's about something most people are terrified to face. The weight of an old wrong that doesn't forget you, even when the world does. And in Mark's case, it followed him for 20 years, until the day came when he couldn't run from it anymore. Mark walked out of the juvenile detention center on a chilly morning, his knuckles scabbed and his record stained. 45 days behind bars hadn't changed the world. But something had shifted inside him. Not clarity, not guilt, not yet, but fear. The kind of fear that whispers, if you keep going like this, you won't live to see 25. So he ran. Not from the neighborhood, he couldn't, not yet, but from the boy he had been, from the street fights, the racial slurs, the anger. He traded weapons for weights. The scrawny, aggressive kid started to bulk up. His fists stopped flying, at least in the alleys. And then, through a combination of talent, swagger, and a little luck, he got a mic in his hand. Marky Mark was born. Suddenly, the tough kid with the rap sheet was flexing abs on MTV. Girls screamed his name, music producers saw dollar signs, record labels saw potential, and he rode that wave, fast and loud. But every rise demands a reinvention. Rap turned to modeling. Modeling turned to acting. And against all odds, Mark Wahlberg, the same teen who once left a man bleeding on the street, became a star. In interviews, he smiled. On red carpets, he posed. He became the guy directors called when they needed a gritty anti-hero or a blue-collar underdog. America ate it up. The studios paid him millions. And still, the past never called his name. No one asked about it. The cameras never caught it, and he never volunteered it. But guilt doesn't need a microphone. It whispers in hotel rooms after the applause fades. It tightens your chest when you hear someone speak the language of a man you once hurt. It floods your face with heat when your own children ask what you were like at their age, and you can't tell them the truth. Years passed. Mark climbed higher. Films, awards, investments, respect. He even dabbled in philanthropy. To the world, he was a success story. From the streets to the spotlight. An American dream. But dreams can't erase damage. Behind the scenes, Mark started asking himself questions he had avoided for decades. What happened to that man? Did he heal? Does he remember my face? And deeper still, can I ever make this right? Or is it too late? It took over 2 decades for the answers to start forming. 2 decades of carrying something he never dared to name. Because becoming someone new doesn't erase the person you used to be. And in Mark's case, the man he became was finally brave enough to look back at the boy he had once been. Mark Wahlberg stood in his sprawling Los Angeles mansion, surrounded by everything success could buy. A family he adored, scripts lined up for the next year, a fridge filled with clean meals, and a mirror that wouldn't lie. It was sometime around 2013 when the weight became unbearable. The world praised his discipline, admired his transformation from a street thug to a Hollywood mogul. But praise doesn't cancel out the past. It doesn't touch the boy who once made another man bleed on the sidewalk for no reason other than hate. He had done everything to leave that chapter behind. Fitness, faith, family, foundations. But trauma doesn't fade just because you do push-ups. You can't deadlift shame away. Every time someone talked about second chances or redemption, Mark would smile publicly. But deep inside, he could feel it. A knot that hadn't untangled in 25 years. And then came the decision. Not a grand epiphany. Not some movie scene breakdown. Just a quiet moment. A stillness where he admitted to himself, I can't move forward unless I go backward. He didn't want to just whisper a quiet apology in his head. He wanted to own it, publicly, fully. No excuses. No hiding behind fame. He sat down and wrote the letter. I am deeply sorry for the actions that I took, as well as for any lasting damage I may have caused the victims. It wasn't a script. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, filled with regret and a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to do the right thing. Then he did something no one expected. He applied for a full pardon from the state of Massachusetts. That's when the real storm began. The news broke. Headlines lit up with words like hate crime, pardon request, Wahlberg's violent past. People who had followed his career for years had no idea. Others remembered. The internet unearthed police reports, mugshots, witness testimonies, the raw details. And the question echoed everywhere. Why now? Some called it bold. Others called it selfish. A few said it was just PR, an attempt to clean up his record so he could open more businesses. Critics didn't mince words. If you were truly sorry, you wouldn't ask to erase it. You'd let it stay on your record, to remind the world of what you did. But underneath the noise, there was something real. Something Mark never denied. What I did was wrong. It hurt people, and being rich or famous doesn't erase that. He didn't defend his youth. He didn't blame his environment. He didn't pretend the pain he caused had an expiration date. And while the media debated motives, one person had the clearest voice of all. The victim, Johnny Trin. And what he would say next would stop the conversation cold. While the media buzzed with Mark Wahlberg's sudden apology and controversial pardon request, one voice remained quiet. the one that mattered most. Johnny Trinh. The man who'd been beaten all those years ago. The man who had tasted pavement and hate in the same breath. The man whose face had been bruised not just by fists, but by a country that often looked the other way when someone like him was hurt. Journalists hunted down the name in the police reports. Few expected a response. After all, decades had passed. No one even knew where Johnny was. But then, suddenly, he spoke. Not in anger, not with vengeance, but with clarity, grace, and something the world didn't expect: forgiveness. He was young and reckless, Johnny said in an interview, but I forgive him now. Everyone deserves another chance. That line struck harder than the original headlines. Johnny didn't justify what happened. He didn't downplay the pain. But he also didn't carry bitterness like a badge. For years, he'd stayed silent, not because he wasn't hurt, but because he had moved forward. He'd served his country, built a life, endured more than most ever knew. And when asked about Mark, he didn't blink. He saw the bigger picture. If someone is truly sorry, you can't hold that against them forever, he added. What's done is done. What matters is what comes next. The internet didn't know what to do with that. Some were moved, others were skeptical. Forgiveness, after all, doesn't always sit well with a world obsessed with punishment. People asked, why now? Why forgive someone who never reached out before the cameras rolled? But Johnny wasn't trying to please anyone. He wasn't offering closure to make headlines. He was simply choosing peace for himself. For Mark, the response was humbling, a gift he never expected. He'd written his apology without knowing whether it would ever be received, let alone answered. And here was the man he had once harmed, offering him what no one else could: release. But forgiveness isn't magic. It doesn't rewrite history. It doesn't unbreak trust or erase scars. It just opens a door, a narrow one, for healing to begin. Whether you step through it or not, that's the real test. For Johnny, the door was already behind him. He'd walked through it years ago. For Mark, the real question was, now that he had been forgiven, what would he do with it? Johnny Trinh had spoken. He forgave Mark Wahlberg. And for a fleeting moment, it felt like the story had found its resolution. Two men, once connected by violence, now standing on opposite ends of a bridge built by remorse and forgiveness. But the world wasn't ready to let it go. The backlash came fast. News anchors, columnists, social media users, everyone had something to say. And this time, it wasn't about what Mark had done in 1988. It was about why he was saying sorry in 2014. The word pardon stuck in people's throats like a stone. Mark's decision to apply for an official pardon from the state of Massachusetts sent a wave of outrage across the country. It felt, to many, like a second erasure. First you assault a man because of his race, and now you want the record wiped clean. Even some of his fans were confused. Some argued that true remorse meant accepting the stain, not scrubbing it away. Others said it was calculated, an image-polishing move from a millionaire with businesses, deals, and a public brand to protect. The discourse wasn't gentle. It was sharp, unforgiving, and loud. Civil rights groups spoke out. Apologizing is one thing, they said, but seeking a pardon is something else entirely. It's not just about you, it's about the message it sends. Journalists brought up other victims, nameless ones, from similar crimes, who never got apologies, who still bore the weight of trauma. They asked, why does remorse get more airtime when the person saying sorry is rich and famous? Even Trinh's forgiveness became a talking point. Some questioned whether it was too quick, too easy. Was he pressured? Was it genuine? But Johnny stayed firm, repeating what he believed, that people change, and that sometimes forgiveness is more about freeing yourself than redeeming the other person. Mark stayed mostly quiet during the storm. No interviews, no statements, just silence. Because this, too, was part of the weight. True remorse isn't tidy. It doesn't get applause. It comes with consequences, even decades later. And while Mark had finally found the courage to face his past, he had no control over how the world would judge him for it. The strange thing about guilt is that it doesn't end with an apology. It deepens, it expands, especially when the world holds a mirror up and forces you to see yourself from every angle. Hero, villain, cautionary tale. Mark never got that pardon. He withdrew the request quietly, after the backlash. Maybe he realized that carrying the record was part of carrying the responsibility. Or maybe he understood that not every chapter of your life gets a clean ending. But one thing had changed, irreversibly. The world now knew what he had spent 2 decades trying to live with, and he couldn't hide from it anymore. There's a moment that comes after the apology. After the headlines fade, after the cameras turn elsewhere. It's the quietest part of reckoning, when the world no longer cares, but you still do. That's where Mark Wahlberg found himself. He didn't get the pardon. He didn't get a standing ovation for his apology. And he didn't get to rewrite his story. But maybe, just maybe, that was the point. He had faced it, all of it. The guilt, the shame, the backlash, the silence. And now, all that was left was to live differently. He didn't speak much about Johnny Trin afterward. He didn't grandstand about forgiveness. He didn't try to turn it into a redemption tour. In fact, what came next was quiet, but not hollow. Mark shifted gears behind the scenes. He invested heavily in at-risk youth programs in Boston, the very streets that had once fueled his rage. He visited juvenile detention centers, not as a celebrity guest, but as someone who understood exactly how lost a 16-year-old boy could feel with nothing but anger in his fists. He gave money, yes, but more than that, he gave time, stories, honesty. I was like you, he'd tell them, and I hurt people, and I've had to live with that. He didn't glamorize his journey. He didn't pretend that success erases pain. Instead, he leaned into the hard truth. Some mistakes follow you forever, and the only way to carry them is by making sure no one else repeats them. There were no press releases about this, no flashy photo ops. It wasn't about cleaning his name anymore. It was about doing the slow, uncomfortable work of repair. Johnny Trin went back to his quiet life, rarely speaking of the incident again. For him, the chapter had closed. But for Mark, it would always remain open. Not as a wound, but as a scar. One he chose to keep visible. And perhaps that was the real transformation. Not the muscles, not the movies, not the fame, but the choice to no longer run from the ugliest part of who he once was. Because the truth about guilt is this: you don't get to decide when it fades. You only get to decide what you do with it. And for the first time in decades, Mark Wahlberg was finally doing something that wasn't for the cameras. It was for the boy he used to be, and the man he was still trying to become. It didn't make headlines, but it mattered. Years after the apology, long after the debates quieted, Mark Wahlberg went on living a life shaped not just by fame, but by the shadow of one violent moment, and the decades it took to face it. He never got the neat redemption arc people crave in movies. There was no dramatic reunion with Johnny Trin on camera. No awards for regret. No moment where the world stood up and said, "You're forgiven." Because in real life, sorry doesn't end the story. It simply makes space for what comes next. Mark continued building his empire. Films, restaurants, businesses. But behind all the glitz was a man who now knew what it meant to live with a mistake that could never be undone. The pardon he withdrew, He never reapplied. His record remained. A reminder, perhaps, that some things are meant to stay on paper, to hold you accountable, even when the world forgets. He raised his children with intention. He told them the truth, eventually. Not in full detail, but enough. Enough for them to understand that success without character means nothing. That being sorry isn't about being forgiven. It's about changing. And maybe that's what this story is really about. Not whether a millionaire deserved redemption, not whether forgiveness was too easy or too late, but whether someone can face the ugliest part of their past and instead of hiding it, live in service to it. The world moved on. Johnny Trin moved on. But Mark Wahlberg? He carries it still. Not as a burden, but as a responsibility. Because the truth is, we all leave marks on others. Some we remember, some we never know. But when one of those scars stares back at you across time and gives you a chance to make peace, the hardest thing you can do is accept that peace won't erase the past. It only gives you a reason to live the future better. Mark never asked for applause, and this story doesn't offer it. But what it does offer is a reminder. Sometimes, being truly sorry means learning to live in a world that may never let you forget, and choosing to show up anyway, every single day, with humility in your heart and change in your hands.